The wind moved across Eden Hollow like a dying breath, dragging dust, heat, and the smell of old regrets across the open plains as the sun dropped low behind the cottonwoods. Mara Ellsworth felt that wind on her face as she knelt beside the stranger she'd pulled from the edge of the dry creek bed, his body limp, shirt torn open, blood running dark and lazy down the deep gash cut across his ribs. He was barely conscious, blinking against the golden light like a man unsure whether he still belonged to this world. She'd found him by accident, or maybe fate had placed him in her path, but as she looked at him now, struggling to breathe, she felt something inside her tighten, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the day her husband died out on the far ridge with no one to hold his hand but the dust. The stranger's voice cracked low, worn out from pain and loss she didn't yet understand. "I'm not worth saving," he whispered, barely more than wind itself, his head turning slightly away from her as if ashamed to be seen. Mara froze, her hand resting on the heat of his chest, feeling the weak, unsteady rise and fall under her palm. She could hear the distant cry of a lone hawk, the slow shifting of her horse tied to a fence post far behind them, the beat of her own heart thudding too loudly for a woman who'd sworn she'd buried all feeling in the same grave as her past. She should have walked away. The world had taught her that strangers were storms. You never knew which ones would bring rain and which ones would tear your roof clean off. But something in his eyes, even bruised and half shut, held a truth she recognized too well, the look of a soul who'd already decided his story was over. She swallowed hard and leaned closer, the sunlight catching soft on her face as she studied him. He was young, too young to carry scars like the ones carved into his skin, too young to be lying in the dirt bleeding out like a man who'd made his last peace. His hair was matted with sweat and dust, and the stubble along his jaw suggested nights spent in the saddle, running from something only he knew. Mara felt him shiver, and without thinking, she pressed her other hand to his cheek, steadying him as his eyes flickered open, focusing on her with a kind of startled confusion. "Why would you say that?" she asked quietly. Her voice had the tone she always used with injured horses, steady, careful, ready to retreat if touched wrong. He gave a breath that was almost a laugh, but not the kind born of humor, more like a broken sound from a man used to disappointment. "Because it's true," he rasped. "Ain't nobody ever come looking for me. Ain't nobody ever gonna—" His words drifted off, and Mara felt that familiar ache, the one that reminded her of nights spent staring at the empty chair at her kitchen table, the one that told her loneliness was a language spoken by many but understood by few. She looked past him, past the sinking sun, toward her ranch, sitting quiet against the far hills. Every board, every nail in that house carried memory. Her husband's boots still sat by the door. His hat still hung on the peg beside the window. She had lived in silence so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to hear someone else breathing under the same sky. But here now, on this dusty ground, a man was fighting not just for breath but for permission to stay alive. And somehow, she was the one he'd cursed with the choice. The stranger's hand twitched weakly toward her wrist, not to push her away, but as if testing whether she was real. "Ma'am," he whispered, "you should let me go. Ain't no good gonna come from keeping me alive." Mara set her jaw in that stubborn way she always had. "You don't get to decide that," she murmured. "Not while you're on my land." He winced as a fresh wave of pain rolled through him, and for a moment she saw fear in his eyes. Fear not of dying, but of being witnessed in his dying. She reached for the torn edges of his shirt, pulling them aside to see the wound clearly. The cut was ugly, deep, and fresh, not more than a couple hours old. A knife, she guessed. Maybe a fight, maybe an ambush, maybe something darker. Whatever it was had been meant to finish him. And maybe it would have if she hadn't ridden out looking for her stray mare at just the right moment. He sucked in a pained breath as she pressed gently along the wound. "Hold still," she said softly, though she knew he didn't have strength to do otherwise. She tore a strip from the hem of her own dress, the fabric ripping loud in the quiet. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated, then closed his eyes. "Callan," he murmured. "Callan Ward." The name meant nothing to her, yet somehow it did. Something about the way he said it carried the weight of a man expecting judgment. "Well, Callan Ward," she said, as she pressed the cloth against his wound, "looks to me like you've lost enough blood to drown a steer. If you were meant to die out here, you would have already. He flinched, but a faint, tired smirk ghosted across his lips. Maybe I was trying to, he said. Mara paused, her hand stilling as she met his gaze full on. The world around them seemed to fall silent, except for the low hum of the settling heat. She knew that tone. She'd heard it the night her husband bled out in her arms after the stampede, his body torn, his eyes dimming as he whispered things she wasn't strong enough to remember. She promised herself she'd never kneel beside another dying body again, yet here she was. She slid her arm under Callan's shoulders, lifting him gently. He groaned, teeth gritting, but he didn't fight her. His weight was warm, heavy, and fading fast. She felt his blood soaking into her dress, felt his breath ghost against her collarbone as he leaned into her without meaning to. "You're gonna live," she whispered fiercely, more to herself than to him. "And you're gonna tell me who cut you open like this and why." His head rested against her shoulder, his voice barely there. "You don't want that truth," he murmured. "Nobody does." She tightened her hold. "Try me." Callan's fingers curled weakly around her arm. His next breath shuddered hard, like a man wrestling with something he'd kept buried for too long. "If I tell you," he whispered, "it'll drag you in too." Mara felt something cold crawl up her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked. But Callan didn't answer. His body sagged heavier against her, his pulse faint beneath her touch, his eyes sliding shut as though surrendering to the darkness he'd fought for too long. "Callan! Hey, stay with me," she said urgently, shaking him gently, feeling panic rise in her chest where no emotion had lived for years. The wind picked up again, sweeping dust around them in slow circles, and somewhere far off a horse cried out like an omen. Mara looked toward her ranch, then back down at the stranger going still in her arms. She realized with a sudden, breath-stealing clarity that bringing him home might not just save him. It might unravel everything she'd built to protect herself. Still, she hooked her arm under his and prepared to lift him onto her horse. But before she could move, Callan's lips parted, and a single, fragile sentence drifted out, changing everything. "They'll come for me," he whispered, "and when they do, they'll come for you too." Mara Ellsworth had carried many burdens in her life. Sorrow, silence, and the long shadow of a love buried too young. But none felt as heavy as the unconscious man she hauled toward her horse. Callan Ward was dead weight in her arms, his breath barely flickering, his head lolling against her shoulder as she struggled to lift him onto the saddle. The sun had nearly vanished, smearing the sky with fading gold and creeping violet, and the air had turned colder than it ought to be for that time of year, as though the land itself sensed trouble drawing near. She mounted behind him, hooking one arm around his waist to keep him upright as she nudged her horse into motion toward her ranch. The rhythmic gait of the mare thudded beneath them, and Mara could feel Callan's heartbeat, faint, uneven, against her forearm. Every beat felt like a question. Was she saving a man destined for death or inviting death to ride home with her? She didn't know, and she didn't care. Some instincts were deeper than fear. By the time they reached the ranch house, the sky was nearly black. The lantern by her porch flickered in the wind like a lonely soul calling for company. She dragged Callan inside, laying him carefully on her late husband's old cot, the same one she'd once mended cattlemen on during storms. She heated water, cleaned his wound, stitched him with shaking hands, and fed him spoonfuls of warm broth until his breathing steadied, though it still rattled like a loose wheel on a wagon road. Hours passed. Midnight crept in. Coyotes yipped far off, answering each other across the empty land. Mara sat beside Callan, watching his chest rise and fall, fighting the memory of another dying man in that same bed years ago. She rubbed her palms together to steady herself, but the tremble inside her refused to settle. Just when her thoughts began to drift, Callan jolted awake with a broken gasp, eyes wide, hand reaching wildly for a weapon he didn't have. Mara grabbed his shoulders and pressed him back down gently. "You're safe," she said. "You're at my ranch." He blinked, dazed, confusion and pain washing across his face like storm clouds. "Why'd you bring me here?" he whispered, voice cracked and dry. Mara hesitated, then answered, "Because you were dying, and because no one deserves to die alone." Callan's jaw tightened as if her kindness hurt worse than his wounds. "You shouldn't have saved me," he said, eyes glinting with something between fear and guilt. "I told you, they're coming." Mara leaned back slightly, her voice low but steady. "Who?" Callan swallowed hard, the movement straining his stitched side. "Men who don't leave witnesses. Men I ran with for too long. I was their tracker, their scout. Helped them pull jobs I ain't proud of. Last job went bad, real bad. Our leader, Reddick Cole, killed a family over nothing. I tried to stop him. He cut me for it, left me for dead." His words trembled not from weakness, but from the memory of horrors he'd carried alone. Mara felt something cold settle into her bones. The name Reddick Cole was not unknown in the territories. Whispers of him drifted through saloons like smoke, a ghost of a man with blood on both hands and none in his heart. She drew a slow breath. "And why would he come here?" Callan's eyes met hers, hollow and honest. "Because I know too much. Because he never leaves loose ends. And because he'll figure someone patched me up, someone with a ranch close to the creek road." Mara didn't move, didn't flinch. "Let him come," she said quietly. "This land's seen worse men." Callan shook his head. "Not like him." She stood, crossing the room to retrieve her husband's old rifle from the wall. Her thumb traced the worn wood, the initials carved into the stock. Memories flared, her husband standing on that porch at sunrise, telling her that life was a storm you didn't survive by hiding, but by standing tall. She turned back to Callan. "I'm not losing another man to the dirt," she said. "Not tonight." The hours that followed crawled slowly, thick with tension. Callan drifted in and out of sleep, murmuring apologies to ghosts she didn't know. Mara sat by the window, rifle across her lap, watching the dark horizon. Then, sometime before dawn, she heard it, the distant crunch of hooves, slow and deliberate. Not riders passing by, riders hunting. The hairs rose on her neck. She blew out the lantern, plunging the room into darkness lit only by the faint glow of the dying embers in the stove. Callan stirred weakly. "They're here," he whispered, voice barely audible. Mara moved to his side. "Then you stay quiet. Let me handle this." "Mara, don't," he breathed. "I ain't worth." She pressed a finger lightly to his lips. "Don't say that again." Outside, silhouettes appeared. 3 riders, maybe 4, shapes barely defined by the moonlight. They dismounted, boots crunching slow and sure on the hard earth. The lead rider's voice drifted across the yard like a venomous drawl. "Callan Ward," the man called. "If you're breathing, you best come out. Ain't no use hiding. We aim to finish what we started." Mara lifted her rifle, steady as stone. She stepped onto the porch, the cold air biting her skin, her nightdress whipping softly in the wind. The men turned toward her, surprised but amused. Their leader tilted his head. "Well now, ain't this something? You patch up a wounded dog, ma'am?" Mara didn't blink. "You're trespassing," she said. "Turn around and go." The men chuckled. Low, cruel sounds. "Ma'am," the leader drawled, "we ain't here for trouble, just collecting what belongs to us." Mara's voice sharpened. "He belongs to no one." The leader smiled, a thin, hungry smile. "Then you're making yourself part of this." Mara raised the rifle higher. "I reckon I am." Behind her, inside, Callan pushed himself weakly up on his elbows, watching through the doorway with dread twisting his face. "Mara, please," he whispered, "don't do this for me." But she didn't lower the gun, and as the men stepped closer, their hands drifting toward their holsters, a strange calm settled over her, a clarity that felt almost like destiny brushing its fingers through her hair. She thought of her husband's words, of the long, lonely years, of the stranger bleeding on her ground whispering he wasn't worth saving. And in that moment she knew, some souls were worth saving precisely because they didn't believe they deserved it. The leader took one more step. "Last chance, ma'am." Mara steadied her breath. "No," she whispered. "Yours." And then, before anyone fired, before anyone breathed, The sun cracked the horizon, spilling a blaze of gold across the ranch just as the first gun was drawn. And that is where fate held its breath. For the full ending and more powerful Wild West stories, make sure you subscribe to Western Destiny Tales. Your support keeps these stories alive on the trail.